everything is being rebooted these days. Little House on the Prairie, the Toxic Avenger, the Karate Kid. I'm not even gonna go into Disney's live action remakes of their animated classics. In this video, I want to explore the problems with rebooting everything under the yellow sun. Now, it is important to note that everything is a remix, okay? I already foresee those comments coming. That's not the issue. A reboot of Star Wars is a reboot of Star Wars, whereas the original Star Wars was a remix of Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, Akira Kurosawa movies, and Frank Herbert's Dune. I know that I just made a video about the Anaconda reboot that is coming out, but I gave my reasons for why horror movies are much, much easier to reboot than other types of movies. So in this video, I want to focus on just the general issues with reboots, and I've come up with 5 talking points to make my argument for the problem with reboots. Again, speaking in general terms, not speaking in specific terms. And the first point that I want to bring up is that most reboots are simply just made for the sake of nostalgia. Okay, why was G.I. Joe Rise of... I know I'm going back to 2009 with this. Why was G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra... Why was G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra made back in 2009? Was it made because of changing filming technology? Or was it made to coincide with the 25th anniversary of the original G.I. Joe cartoon that came out in 1984? The reason for G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra's creation probably has more to do with the latter rather than the former. And I'm not saying that G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra was a bad movie. I actually went to go see that in theaters. But no one really talks about G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra anymore. And I think that the biggest reason why no one talks about G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra anymore was because it was basically just made to capitalize upon the nostalgia of the original cartoon. And there was a sequel to that made that was a G.I. Joe Retaliation, and boy, that one doesn't really get talked about. So now I'm gonna move on from G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra. If we look at Star Wars: The Force Awakens, okay, we could effectively. I'm just gonna say this just for sake of argument, is that all The Force Awakens was effectively just a reboot of the original movie, and that's it. Okay, everything in Star Wars: The Force Awakens was put in there for the sake of nostalgia. Right, when they introduced the Millennium Falcon, it's also why they have X-Wings and TIE fighters. Everything in that movie, the Star Wars iconography of the original trilogy being put in there was not done for some creative purpose. It was all done for the sake of nostalgia. And when people are going back and re-examining The Force Awakens now, what they're saying is that, okay, it's been 30 years since the end of Return of the Jedi, but yet we're still on X-Wings, TIE fighters, and the Millennium Falcon. The Star Wars universe never actually progressed. Because say what you want about the prequels, but at least the prequels didn't include X-Wings, TIE fighters, the Death Star. At least the prequel trilogy included like different types of ships. And so, okay, you have the prequels that all the ships were different. Then you have the original trilogy, obviously X-Wings, TIE fighters, and Millennium Falcon. But then you get to the sequel trilogy, it's still X-Wings, TIE fighters, and the Millennium Falcon. Right? They're just being made for... A lot of these reboots are just being made for the sake of nostalgia alone. And now I would argue that yes, nostalgia does sell. Look at the success of Star Wars: The Force Awakens and Jurassic World. But there is something that the Jurassic World movies and the Star Wars sequel trilogy share, in the sense that the first movie was very, very beloved by general audiences. Then you get to the second movie, which was very, very divisive. Some loved it. You either loved it or you hated it. I'm referring to The Last Jedi and Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom. And then you get to the third and final movie within that trilogy, within the sequel trilogy, and the first Jurassic World trilogy. I know they're making a Jurassic World 4 now, but it's not connected. They're not bringing back Chris Pratt or Bryce Dallas Howard. But anyway, you get to the third movie. You get to Rise of Skywalker and Jurassic World Dominion, and those movies are universally shat upon by everybody. So, again, you have the first movie in each of those respective series, Star Wars The Force Awakens and Jurassic World, basically sold themselves on nostalgia alone, because both are effectively soft remakes of their predecessors. Star Wars Force Awakens being a soft remake of the original Star Wars, and Jurassic World effectively being a soft remake of the original Jurassic Park. And we saw what happened with those sequels down the line. The nostalgia wore off, and that's the issue with remaking something just for the sake of nostalgia. I know I've gone on really long with this point, but I'm going to end off this point with this. Remaking something simply for nostalgia's sake is going to work in the short term, but in the long term, the nostalgia is going to wear off. And when people go back and re-examine it, like they're doing right now with they're doing right now with Star Wars: The Force Awakens, they're realizing that, oh, this movie was only made just to capitalize upon nostalgia and nothing else. And that's when you're going to have these. That's when you have these remakes that, you know, we could argue made a crap ton of money. Star Wars: Force Awakens made over $2 billion worldwide. Jurassic World made, I think, $1.6 billion worldwide. If I'm not mistaken, I think Jurassic World actually made more money than the original Jurassic Park. But again, the remakes just for nostalgia's sake, in my opinion, eventually are going to disappear into the ether, because many people are just going to prefer to watch the originals because, oh, it's just a remake of the original. Why am I wasting my time watching Star Wars: The Force Awakens or Jurassic World when I could just watch the original Star Wars or Jurassic Park from 1993? Right, that's the other issue. And okay, I've spent way too long on this point. My second talking point is going to be the problem with reboots is that, simply put, the original is simply a product of its time. Okay, I brought up the example with G.I. Joe at the very beginning. If we're being honest about the original G.I. Joe cartoon from the 80s, it is absolutely a product of the 1980s. And any attempt to remake it in the modern day is going to fall apart. They tried remaking it back in the early 2000s with a made-for-TV movie on Cartoon Network, and I, for the life of me, cannot remember what that was called, but there was a direct-to-video sequel to that movie that was made in 2004 called G.I. Joe Valor vs. Venom. That one I do remember because I at least saw that one. They basically took the original G.I. Joe, updated it for the 2000s, but instead of them fighting Cobra, they're fighting like robot mechs. Shocker, it didn't really catch on. Then you had G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra, like I said, that happened to release for the 25th anniversary of the original cartoon. But then you get its sequel, G.I. Joe Retaliation, and that all but disappeared into the ether, because no one wanted to acknowledge with G.I. Joe that the original G.I. Joe was a product of the 1980s. And I foresee this same problem for the upcoming Toxic Avenger remake that is finally releasing later this year. I know it was first screened at film festivals in 2023, but it is finally coming out. But still, no one wants to acknowledge that the Toxic Avenger was a product of the 1980s, and any attempt to try to bring it out of the 80s is going to be a real challenge. You know, even Troma themselves couldn't really do a decent remake. If you look at Return to Nukem High that came out in the early 2010s. Return to Nukem High, and then Return to Nukem High, aka Volume 2, which didn't release until like 2019. But still, you look at the original Class of Nukem High, I believe it came out in 86. And if you're really examining Class of Nukem High, you could also make the realization, like, you know what? You know what? Class of Nukem High is clearly a product of the 1980s. Lloyd Kaufman tried bringing it up into the 2010s, and in my opinion, it just didn't work, because you can't bring Class of Nukem High out of the 1980s. Now there are some remakes that have done that very, very successfully. For example, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was successfully rebooted twice on television. You obviously had the original cartoon from the 80s. No one talks about the live-action show from the 90s, believe you me. But the Ninja Turtles were successfully rebooted in the early 2000s with the 2003 series obviously going a little more darker. And then the Ninja Turtles were successfully rebooted again in 2012 on Nickelodeon. But here's the thing with the Ninja Turtles. You can look at all the successful reboots of it, right? You talk about the original cartoon, then it was rebooted into a live action movie in 1990 that led to 2 sequels. We're talking about the 2003 series, talk about the 2012 series. For just as many successful reboots of the Ninja Turtles, there's also just as many failures. I brought up Saban's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles from the 90s. That was the first live action TV series of the Ninja Turtles, and believe you me, no one talks about it. There was an attempt to reboot the Ninja Turtles into a movie back in 2007. That was TMNT. Now, personally, I did enjoy TMNT, but the general audience largely rejected TMNT at the time. It came out in 2007. You then had the Michael Bay movies. The first one coming out in 2014, and then you had its sequel, which was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Out of the Shadows. And those are the ones where the turtles looked whited up. Again, Michael Bay's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was largely rejected by the general public. I mean, the first movie made enough money to obviously justify a sequel, but again, making enough money to justify a sequel proves absolutely nothing. You then had Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that came after the conclusion of the 2012 series. And that one didn't really latch on like the 2012 series did, and I argue it's because the art style is way more avant-garde than the 2012 series. And then you had most recently Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Mutant Mayhem, and even that one didn't really latch on. Now we can go on and on about the reasons why Mutant Mayhem didn't catch on. Was it because they made April O'Neil black? I don't think so. I don't think race swapped April O'Neil really did the damage to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Mutant Mayhem. I think what happened once again is that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Mutant Mayhem, just like Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, went with such an avant-garde art style that it just turned a lot of the general audience off, because the animation itself was a little too weird. But anyway, I think the point that I'm trying to get at is that sometimes you have to acknowledge that what you're rebooting was simply just a product of the time that it came out in. In my Anaconda reboot video, where I talk about why horror movies are very easy to reboot by comparison to other genres, I bring up The Day the Earth Stood Still, right? I know it's not a horror movie. It was a science fiction movie. It came out in the 50s. And it was made to reflect the nuclear age. The Day the Earth Stood Still got a remake in 2008 where they tried to update The Day the Earth Stood Still, but made to reflect more of a post 9/11 world. It didn't work. I understand what they were going for, but it didn't work. Okay, the point that I'm trying to make is that The Day the Earth Stood Still was a product of the 1950s, and you're not getting around that. Trying to go back and modernizing it for the modern day is going to be a very tall order, because trying to rip something out of its time period and transplanting it, 60, 70 years into the future, it might work. But as history has shown, you have a lot more failures than successes, right? And the third talking point that I want to bring up is the idea of character and brand dilution, Right. The other issue with reboots, the fact that you're just rebooting everything. Look what's happening with Star Wars right now. Right. I'm just gonna ignore the sequel trilogy because the sequel trilogy didn't really cause this. Look what's happening to Star Wars right now on Disney Plus after The Mandalorian season 1. Okay, they greenlit every single, Disney Plus, Star Wars Disney Plus show under the yellow sun, and what has that led to? It's led to so many shows that vary so wildly in quality that people have to trudge through a whole lot of shit in order to get to the good stuff, that the effort to get to the good stuff just simply isn't worth it. This just simply isn't worth it right now. Look at what happened to Skeleton Crew. Skeleton Crew, widely praised by both critics and audiences. But guess what? Skeleton Crew got even lower ratings than The Acolyte, which was ripped apart by the audience. Legitimate criticism or not, I'm not here to debate that. But still, here you have a Star Wars show, you have Skeleton Crew, get all of this praise from both critics and audiences, yet no one watched it. The same exact thing happened to Andor season 1 back in 2022. It got all of this critical praise, but no one watched it. And Tony Gilroy famously admitted to IndieWire that he thought that the audiences would latch on to the show first and that they would chase the critics, when in reality what happened is that they got the critical praise and and the show was chasing the audience. So again, that's another thing that you have to be careful of when you're rebooting something, is that it's going to just lead to character and overall brand dilution. Let's bring it back to Little House on the Prairie, which was a very beloved show from the 70s, starring Michael Landon. What's going to happen if the reboot falls apart? It could retroactively damage that original series. So if you're looking at the original Little House on the Prairie as a cash cow, right, you have a bad remake that leads to overall brand dilution, where it's like, oh, this Little House on the Prairie was crap, and no one watches the one from the 70s. For whatever reason, they might view it as too old school, whatever. There's legitimate reasons to not watch the original Little House on the Prairie, and even the remake of the Toxic Avenger. I'm actually surprised Troma even agreed to doing it, because again, if it comes out and it's bad, what's going to make people say, I want to go back and watch the original Toxic Avenger and its original 3 sequels because I saw the new Toxic Avenger and that one was bad? So it's not just character and brand dilution. I should have also added a third point, in that you could also argue brand damage, right? Where the reboot comes out and it's so bad that it retroactively harms the original that it's rebooting. Now no one wants to go back and watch that original, because what's the point if the reboot was bad? What's the original movie going to be like? The fourth point I want to bring up is something that's actually a lot more practical, in that if everything under the yellow sun is getting rebooted, then what that means is that there's nothing for the next generation to latch onto. Okay, what is going to be the next generation's He-Man and the Masters of the Universe? What's going to be the next generation's G.I. Joe? What's going to be the next generation's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? What's going to be the next generation's Star Wars? What's going to be the next generation's Jurassic Park? So on and so forth. I can keep going on and on and on with this point, right? Is if there's no new franchises that are being made for the next generation, now we can make the argument that the MCU was the millennials' Star Wars, and I would actually argue that you're not wrong, and more specifically the Avengers, right? When the Avengers came out, okay, the Avengers was the millennials' Star Wars. And you would have a point when you make that. However, that is now increasingly more and more becoming the exception, and not really the rule. Because if everyone keeps prioritizing, rebooting everything from the 70s and 80s, like Little House on the Prairie, Toxic Avenger, the Karate Kid, what's gonna be the next Toxic Avenger? Well, the next Toxic Avenger, the next Star Wars, the next He-Man is all going to be pushed to the side because look, there's a new He-Man, there's a new Masters of the Universe cartoon coming out to Netflix. There's a new Little House on the Prairie show coming out to Netflix. There's a new Toxic Avenger movie. There's going to be a Star Wars episode 10. Right? It goes back to that episode of The Simpsons. Right? Malibu Stacy gets a new hat. When Lisa creates a new doll, they release it, but then on the very same day they release a brand new Malibu Stacy. Malibu Stacy gets a brand new hat. Everybody buys the Malibu Stacy instead of the newer doll. And part of the blame can be shifted onto the audience. You can't keep complaining about all of these reboots and remakes if you're flocking to go see them. If you flock to go see the Toxic Avenger reboot, and they start making sequels to it, and you start crying, bitching, complaining that all they're focusing on is just the reboot of the Toxic Avenger. It's like, okay, well, let's look at the box office. Oh, it actually was a box office hit. Yeah, no wonder they're focusing on it. It's why they made a sequel to Michael Bay's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles from 2014. Okay, now, me personally, when I first saw the trailer and I saw the roided up turtles, I instantly rejected it. However, Paramount felt that it did well enough at the box office to actually warrant a sequel. So again, you can blame the reboot culture on the major studios choosing to prioritize reboots over everything else. But I also argue that part of the blame has to go onto the audience, because if you just stopped flocking to go see the reboots, they would probably grind to a screeching halt a lot faster than you think. But when you get cases where Jurassic World made more money than the original Jurassic Park did, and then you get the quote-unquote live-action remake of The Lion King, which I believe made more money, even adjusted for inflation, than the original animated movie from '94, sure, there's nothing for the next generation to latch onto, but if the next generation is flocking to these reboots, it's this death spiral. Is, the next generation has no real big franchises of their own, but they're flocking to go see these reboots anyway, while then simultaneously crying, bitching, and moaning that they don't have any franchises of their own. They don't have their own Masters of the Universe. They don't have their own Ninja Turtles. They don't have their own Star Wars. So again, this is one where, again, I argue the blame can be shared. The audience less so. I argue it's like 90% the studios and 10% the audience, because if the audience is being spoon-fed nothing but reboot after reboot after reboot, you can't blame the audience for latching onto them if that's all that's being served to them. Okay, that's why I've said is that the studios absolutely deserve the overwhelming majority of the blame for this reboot culture. I argue 90%, and the audience only 10%. And specifically the audience that keeps crying, bitching, and moaning about how there's nothing original, but they choose to have very short-term memories in terms of film history, and they're refusing to go back and actually watch stuff from the past that's actually not being touched, or they're refusing to give anything else a chance. A movie like The Bike Riders, which came out last year with Austin Butler, and I'm not saying that The Bike Riders was like the greatest movie ever made, but if we're comparing and contrasting box office numbers, The Bike Riders, I believe, only made $35 million in its total box office run, and it released over the summer of 2024. So again, these non IP movies and non reboots are coming out, yet everyone is basically just choosing not to watch them. So again, the problem with rebooting everything is the fact that there's nothing for the next generation to latch onto. But anything that tries to come out and tries to be the next big thing for the new generation, the next generation largely ignores in favor of the reboot anyway. So why not reboot everything under the yellow sun? And I know this video has gone on for way longer than it probably needs to go. So I'm going to end off the video with my fifth and final talking point for why rebooting everything under the yellow sun is bad, and that the biggest issue that I've been saving for the end is that the reboot will always be compared to the original. Okay, if the Toxic Avenger reboot comes out and it's a pile of dog shit, it's going to be compared to the one from '84. And what people are going to look at, and God forbid, this could happen, right? Because you have the Toxic Avenger remake had hundreds of millions of dollars put behind it as a big budget remake of the Toxic Avenger. And it comes out, everyone complains that it's bland, because the problem with putting, $100 million behind a movie is that you have to tend to appease every single Tom, Dick, and Harry that comes along. Okay, Toxic Avenger reboot comes out, everyone complains that it's bland. They go back and watch the one from '84, and it's like, holy shit, look at what they were able to accomplish with such a small budget. And because the budget for the original Toxic Avenger was so small, they didn't have to appease every single Tom, Dick, and Harry to make a profit. Now, the Toxic Avenger is the biggest, is Troma's biggest franchise. In fact, Toxie is now it is now Troma's mascot. But still, that's another thing for, if the reboot is back, because the exact same thing happened with 2010's Karate Kid. Now, 2010's Karate Kid did make money, but the 2010 reboot of the Karate Kid was compared to the original from '84, starring Ralph Macchio and Pat Morita. And that's the one thing that simply you're not going to get around, especially if you're rebooting something as iconic as Little House on the Prairie, the Toxic Avenger, or the Karate Kid, is that it's always going to be compared to the original that you're rebooting. You're effectively setting yourself up for failure in this regard. So, to close this video out, why is rebooting everything under the yellow sun such a bad idea? Because number one, most of these reboots are made just for the sake of nostalgia by itself. Most things that are being rebooted for modern times are simply just products of their time. So think stuff like G.I. Joe. The problem with all these reboots is that it leads to overall character and brand dilution. It also leads to brand damage as a whole, because you have so many bad reboots that no one wants to waste their time with the original. There's nothing for the next generation to latch onto, but subsequently that next generation is latching onto the reboots because those reboots are the only things that are being spoon-fed to them. So again, it's like 90%. It's like 90% audience. Not 90% studios are to blame for all these reboots, and 10% of the blame goes on to the audience that is willing, that is being spoon-fed this, that are willingly going to see it and choosing to not give anything else a chance. And finally, if you're rebooting something that is just as beloved as Little House on the Prairie, the Toxic Avenger, or the Karate Kid, it's always going to be compared to the original, no matter what you do.